Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us this morning for this online event on safeguarding food security in the EU and beyond, organised by the European Commission representation in Ireland and with the support of the European Movement Ireland. We have a great session lined up for you today. Just a couple of opening remarks from me. Over the past years, hunger and malnutrition have increased worldwide due to conflicts, natural disasters, climate change, and COVID-19 pandemic. Food security has become one of the most pressing global challenges. Russia's unjustified invasion of Ukraine has added to this toxic mix and jeopardized food security of the world's poorest countries, who rely heavily on the import of basic food staples and fertilizers. Ukraine, which is often called the world's breadbasket, has had its exports collapse. Global food prices have skyrocketed and are now around 30% higher than this time last year. The EU is working with its international partners to unblock Ukraine's food exports. And it's important to note that the sanctions that the EU has imposed on Russia and Belarus have excluded the agricultural sector. The EU and its member states continue to implement a wide range of humanitarian and development programs on food security and sustainable agriculture worldwide. The EU remains the principal provider of humanitarian and development assistance on food and food systems in the world. Thankfully, the EU food system is not at risk because we produce most of the agricultural products we need. But there has been, of course, a sharp increase in food prices and input costs such as fertilizer and fossil fuel energy. And we see this in rising inflation across our member states. The European Commission has taken action to support consumers and farmers in the EU. For example, EU member states may implement reduced rates of VAT. 500 million will be distributed in national allocations to directly support farmers most affected by higher input costs and closure of export markets. An exceptional and temporary derogation has been granted to allow the production of crops on land set aside within the EU, while maintaining full greening payments for farmers. And the EU has reinforced its financial commitment to partner countries in Africa. A total of over €500 million will be targeted in particular on increasing food security in the Sahel and Lake Chad area, where millions of people are already in an acute situation. So that's it from me. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by some of the prominent experts working in this field in Europe and in Ireland. First up, I'm pleased to welcome the Deputy Director General of DG Agri, DG Agriculture and Rural Development in the European Commission, Michael Scannell. Second, we have Joanna Reid, the Director of International Programs at the International Humanitarian Response Agency, GOAL. We also have Professor Michael Wallace, who is the Professor of Agriculture and Food Economics and Head of the Agribusiness and Rural Development section at UCD. And finally, we have the nutrition activist, young activist, Sophie Hilito to join us today. So before giving the floor to our speakers, just a couple of practical information points for the audience. Everybody can join the discussion on Twitter using the hashtag food security, all one word, with a capital F and a capital S. So hashtag food security. When tweeting, please include the handles at EU Ireland, which is all one word, EUR Ireland, and at EMI Ireland, all one word. And questions can also be submitted via EMI Live Event Centre or emailed to events@europeanmovement.ie, all small case. You can see the address at the bottom of the screen. So I am now pleased to call on our first speaker, my colleague from DG Agriculture and Rural Development, Michael Scannell, who is the Deputy Director General. Michael has held a wide range of posts over a 30-year career in the European Commission, specialising in food safety and animal health, agriculture, trade, audit and international issues. He was also the key person behind the Commission's Global Food Security Package of March this year, which was produced very rapidly in response to the war in Ukraine. Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon, colleagues. I'll try and briefly go through the key issues. First and foremost, have we a problem with food security? And the answer there is obvious. Yes, you only have to look at the headlines and the work and conclusions of all the major international bodies, whether UN, G7, G20, European Council. Food security is literally the #1 item on their policy agenda. This, however, isn't necessarily a new problem. It's not just a result of the events in Ukraine. Even before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, we were already seeing important tensions on global markets, in large part linked to the COVID pandemic. We have highly sophisticated agri-food chains worldwide, and they were shaken badly during the pandemic. And already the Commission had identified key vulnerabilities resulting from the pandemic on our agri-food chain. And that explains why in October last year, we had a communication on food security and crisis preparedness. However, recent events have basically added to the urgency of addressing this particular issue, because the loss of Ukrainian grains and oilseeds on world markets essentially added fuel to an existing fire and have created new tensions and concerns over not just the availability of food, but its affordability. And you can see that in all the statistics. Now, moving on, and I think this is the key issue, what is the EU doing about it? And we adopted a communication in March, essentially outlining 3 main strands of action within the EU itself, what we can do to assist Ukraine in the current predicament, and then the global situation. And taking you through briefly on all 3. Within the EU, we're currently in a relatively good position in relation to our own food security. Thanks to the CAP, we have a highly productive and efficient agri-food system. It's always given an extremely high priority to food security, going back to the founding treaties and the post-World War II period, where we already then had sharp reminders that you had to give a very high priority to keeping your citizens fed with safe, high quality, affordable food. And to put this in context, and taking the example of the commodity most mentioned in the current context, wheat. We will, all going well, produce anything between 125 and 130 million tons of wheat in the forthcoming harvest. That's more than sufficient for our needs. In fact, it will leave an exportable surplus of anything from 35 to 40 million tons. That's almost 20% of world trade in wheat. It's twice what Ukraine was exporting before the war. And that just emphasizes the key role played by Europe on export markets. So yes, we have sufficient food to keep our own citizens fed. Of course, there are issues with sustainability and how we adapt to climate change. There are issues with affordability, but we have, as I say, a highly efficient and effective agri-food system. Moving on, we identified actions to assist Ukraine as key to addressing the overall challenges on food security, for the simple reason this is a neighboring country. It's now subject to an aggressive war. It has a population of 42 million people. So for humanitarian reasons alone, we need to assist Ukraine to maintain its position on world markets. And that means in particular compensating for the closure of the Ukrainian Black Sea ports. Normally, they were exporting 5 to 6 million tons of grains every single month through those ports. They're currently closed. We're working extremely hard through the so-called solidarity lanes to create road, rail, and barge alternatives. It's a huge challenge. This is not something you can do in days or weeks. but we're making good progress. So as an example, last month, we calculate that over 1.5 million tons were exported through these alternative sources. And we're working hard to increase on that figure, to ease the tensions on the world markets, to basically provide an income for Ukrainian farmers and give them the resources for the next planting season. The challenges are huge, and if we fail in this context, we'll have big problems when the next harvest comes on stream in Ukraine, because very quickly their existing storage capacity will fill, and as I mentioned, they would face issues in relation to affordability for their next harvest. So it's extremely important that we successfully address that particular issue. Then moving on to the global situation, where in the developing world especially, they're confronted with both affordability and availability issues. And we're working with our international partners, in particular the UN family, to improve the situation on the ground. And Barbara mentioned already the package of measures adopted for the Sahel, Horn of Africa, Lake Chad area, big pledging conferences towards which the EU made very, very significant contributions. But it's not just an issue of humanitarian aid. We also have to work with these countries to improve their own agricultural productivity so that they can reduce their let's say, their critical structural reliance on imports and humanitarian aid. So basically, we have to help them boost on the ground the efficiency and effectiveness of their farming community and give them the resources to take on that major challenge. And it is indeed a huge challenge. But I think, as you've seen from the headlines in recent weeks, the entire international community is very much committed to taking on this challenge. And basically, we have also to put our shoulder to the wheel. Now, some final words. We can't lose sight. While this is an immediate short-term issue on food security, we need to keep in mind the bigger picture. So here in Europe, we need to be mindful of our own weaknesses. We have a critical reliance on imports of key inputs for our agri-food system. For example, fossil fuels, gas for our fertilizer industry, a reliance on imports of fertilizers in general. And without those fertilizers, using our current agri-food production models, our yields would be compromised. So we need to be very alert to that vulnerability. And similarly, we need to be extremely alert to the even greater challenge from climate change. We're already committed at the EU level to a reform of the CAP. It enters into force on the 1st of January next year, where we aim to move in a far more sustainable direction to ensure that we can produce food while taking account of the critical challenges from climate change. In other words, doing it in a much more sustainable manner. And we have to be careful in the current context that we are not unduly distracted from that even bigger structural challenge. And then finally, we can't lose sight also of the other very important issues in relation to, for example, diet, health, and nutrition. So not just the quantities of food we produce, but which foods and how we use them, and how we use them, for example, between food uses, feed uses, and industrial uses. But these are issues, as I say, perhaps for another day. I'll stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now I'd like to invite our second speaker, Joanna Reid, who is the Director of International Programs at GOAL. Joanna joined GOAL in September 2020 from the UK Government Department for International Development, the DFID, where she held several senior positions, including most recently head of the DFID in Pakistan, which is the DFID's biggest overseas program. Joanna, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and thank you for the opportunity to share GOAL's experience as an international development actor. I'm going to stick very closely to the title of this event, Safeguarding Food Security in the EU and Beyond. And I was delighted to hear Michael refer to so much of what I'm going to pick up in what I would like to say. So I think the themes are strong. And international development is all about the beyond. It's beyond our own countries. And one thing that the Ukraine conflict has demonstrated very starkly is that beyond is no longer over there. It's not out of sight or out of mind. The war means that global interconnectedness is playing out very clearly. Beyond turned out to be on Europe's doorstep, and beyond came to us. Now, rightly or wrongly, we didn't really notice Afghans, Syrians, Sudanese arriving. And yet for Ireland, and indeed for my own country, Scotland, our history tells us that we know all about migration as a response to food shortages. People have been moving for centuries because they are not food secure, so they looked beyond for their solutions. So beyond Ireland and beyond the EU is where Go works. And I'll move on to the safeguarding part of the title. And in fact, much of the world simply doesn't have food security to safeguard. In 2021, 193 million people in 53 countries experienced acute food shortages at crisis levels or worse. Now, just yesterday, FAO, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, published its 2022 report, The State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, and it makes absolutely grim reading. It quotes the number of people affected by hunger at 828 million and 2.3 billion moderately or severely food insecure in 2021. That's almost a third of the world's population. So that's beyond the crisis, the 193 million people that I'm talking about in crisis. And interestingly, that report comes with a very interactive graphic that asks, have you eaten today? I recommend it highly. Now, none of us knows where we're sitting. This is a remote event. I happen to be sitting in Belgium, and it tells me that in Belgium there are 100,000 severely food insecure people here, 1.3% of the population. In Ireland, that figure is 200,000, 3.2% of the population. The main drivers of food crises are conflict and climate change. Michael's referred to those. We thought that conflict didn't really affect us in this part of the world until we discovered that 26 countries rely on Ukraine for at least 50% of their wheat imports, and that Russia and Belarus supply much of the world's fertilizer. That I didn't know. But Goal sees the impact of conflict and climate change very starkly in our work. The Horn of Africa has experienced 4 successive failed rainy seasons. That's 4 years in a row, and we have the worst drought there for 40 years as a result of climate change. And now 1 person is likely to die from hunger every 48 seconds. In South Sudan, where Goal has worked for over 30 years, food security was already at catastrophic levels. Over 60% of the population don't have enough to eat. Now, South Sudan imports around 70% of its cereals, and people spend over 60% of their income on food. The Irish equivalent pre-pandemic was less than 10%. In drought-affected Ethiopia, over 1.5 million livestock deaths were recorded in 1 month alone earlier this year. And our team there describes harrowing scenes of carcasses lying at the side of roads while communities struggle to find water for themselves. All of the communities that Go works in are fragile, including now Ukraine. And we believe in creating food security. We call it resilience. So Go, as Barbara said, is a humanitarian response organisation. That's what we do. But we stay on and we help communities to move beyond the crisis to resilience. Resilience to climate shocks, resilience to the effects of conflict, and yes, resilient to the impacts of COVID. Now, food handouts should be a last resort. They distort markets and they skew coping mechanisms. And what we need to do is strengthen those systems to create resilience, not cut across them. Communities need strong systems, not sticking plasters. And yet, only 8% of all food security funding in emergencies goes to help agricultural production. And that's in spite of the fact that investment in agriculture and rural livelihoods is up to 10% more cost effective than traditional food aid. So community and country level systems matter, and so do global ones. Solutions need political will and the right kind of resourcing. And this applies to conflict resolution, action on climate change, agricultural policies, funding for the agricultural sector, and humanitarian funding. We know that agricultural sector funding support runs the risk of distorting markets and hurting the environment, and it can create incentives around staples such as rice and sugar and meats, rather than more nutritious foods such as fruit, vegetables and pulses. And that's why I was so pleased to hear Michael mention nutrition, not just food itself. But also, humanitarian short-term funding does not allow for the kind of investment in systems that we need to build resilience. I want to end by returning to the theme of beyond, with an emotive and economic illustration of why food security matters. Food insecurity doesn't just mean millions of people, millions of children going hungry. Beyond hungry is acute and then chronic malnutrition. The consequences of chronic malnutrition in children is irreversible. Children are shorter, they're stunted, their brains don't develop properly, they do less well at school, and they grow up to earn less as adults. Now, it's estimated that 149 million children are chronically malnourished. They will never make that up. They cannot make that up in their lives. And this is a profound constraint to economic growth in these countries. It's estimated that malnutrition costs $3.5 trillion to the global economy. And that doesn't help these countries work themselves towards a better world. So meetings like these can be learning platforms. I hope we will learn from each other. They may be calls to action. We can make personal choices, and governments and institutions like the European Commission can make choices. So let's help to create and then safeguard food security through helping countries to become resilient to climate change, to conflict, to COVID. And let's invest in systems, not sticking plasters, systems that help communities move beyond the immediate food security crisis, allow children to eat and to thrive, and to support economies to grow. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna, and those sobering figures on child malnutrition, I think very, very, very upsetting to think about. Next, our next speaker now is Michael Wallace, who is Professor of Agriculture and Food Economics and Head of the Agribusiness and Rural Development section in University College Dublin. Professor Wallace studied at Queen's University and University of Warwick, and he has previously held academic positions at Queen's University Belfast and Newcastle University. So, Professor Wallace, please, over to you.
Thank you, Barbara. It's really a privilege for me to be able to address the webinar today. The unfolding food crisis exacerbated by the devastating war in Ukraine brings a renewed focus, as we've heard, on the vulnerabilities of our food system, and particularly in relation to its dependence on imported fossil fuels and certain other inputs. And I think that this particular crisis needs to re-energize international efforts towards a more integrated long-term global strategy for food security. And the EU has clearly a vital leadership role to play in that regard. As we've heard in opening remarks from Barbara and Michael, the EU has acted swiftly and with urgency across a range of areas to assist the food sector and reinforce food security, supporting Ukraine and introducing a range of measures. And certainly these initial responses that we've heard about have been very important and indeed necessary. But thinking in terms of the types of support given to EU consumers and farmers, I would argue that aspects of the work to date have been somewhat ad hoc, and that perhaps reflects the urgency with which measures had to be introduced clearly. And they've also lacked sufficient capacity to deal with the depths of the needs that are emerging. What we've had are specific standalone, one-off type measures that have provided only modest relief to consumers and farmers, and they've lacked adequate targeting. And that's particularly evident in sectors which are experiencing particular crises at the moment, such as pigs and horticulture. So looking ahead, we will require better coordinated approaches for managing food security and consumers' affordability risks over longer timescales. So thinking about that, those longer term food security issues, I think we recognize that it's been forecast that global agricultural output needs to increase by at least 50% by mid-century to meet the food needs of the growing world population. And meanwhile, that has to be achieved while simultaneously addressing the dilemmas of climate change and depletion of natural resources. The task ahead is truly enormous. And we should ask rightly the role the EU should play in addressing this global security challenge and how it should lead in those efforts. What impacts that should have on the EU's own agri-food policies, and how we promote our own levels of output, and the types of assistance we provide to food insecure nations to help them increase their own food production and resilience. Within the EU, since the 1990s, we've moved away from a production-centered approach that arose from Europe's experiences with food insecurity during the Second World War. And this shift has clearly been characterized by a greater policy focus on the environment and the aim of improved sustainability, environmental sustainability particularly, that is we've seen as being central to the recent CAP reform and the farm to fork strategy. Few would disagree with this ambition. But unfortunately, policies promoting sustainability and food security are often fraught with contradictions and indeed shortcomings. We struggle sometimes to define what we mean by sustainability and how we should go about measuring it. And we also struggle with very difficult trade-offs that arise in terms of balancing the need to improve environmental outputs on farms and also the need to produce more food. And one of the side effects that we've had of trying to address the environmental requirements has been the plateauing of European crop yields, a sharp decline in agricultural productivity growth in Europe over recent decades. We also know that action on climate change is absolutely necessary to reduce risks to food security from more extremes such as droughts and flooding. And also alongside that, we have to be open about the upfront costs of measures needed to decarbonize our food system and the potential that those measures may curtail aspects of production. Consequently, international climate mitigation measures will not be cost-free and are likely to put further upward pressure on food prices in the medium term. The EU farm to fork strategy has set a target of 25% of land under organic farming. But given the lower output potential of organic systems, this level of ambition almost seems at odds with the current food security and affordability challenges. On the other hand, I think we have to welcome, and we should welcome, the ambition to reduce our food system's reliance on fossil energy, pesticides, and chemical fertilizers, and recent increases in input prices are likely to accelerate moves in that direction. But sustaining levels of output with lower usage of input will require system-wide adaptations in farm management, which represents significant challenges. We need better targeting of inputs using precision farming technologies, for example. But many of these technologies require significant investments in human and financial capital, and often their adoption tends to be favored on larger farms, which can benefit from the economies of scale. So how do we reach out across the distribution of farms with these types of innovations? Investment in research and innovation is absolutely critical in the search for solutions. And here the 10 billion allocated through Horizon Europe is especially relevant. However, there is intense competition for resources across diverse demands on those resources, the range of themes that need to be tackled. And that means that there may often be a relatively small share of that funding for programs specifically addressing food security issues. I think we also need to look at our regulatory stances on certain technologies that can boost output. For example, genomic tools. Sometimes an excessively cautious approach can stifle potential emerging innovations to the detriment of food security. So we need to be observant to those possibilities. And finally, we need to mobilize advisory services and knowledge sharing to accelerate innovation among farmers to boost output and production to meet the challenges. And this priority involves broadening the engagement of the farming population with knowledge exchange, and helping more farmers move closer to the benchmarks of sustainability performance. We know that significant opportunities exist to address performance gaps that will benefit farm incomes, food security, and the environment. But still, the scale of the necessary transformation of mindsets is enormous. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now we're on to our final speaker, Sophie Hilito, who is a nutrition activist and has a very impressive CV for such a young person. So I'll just give you the highlights, which are Sophie is a youth activist who promotes food security and gender equality. She's a lead group member of the Scaling Up Nutrition movement, serves on the board of the leading international charity ActionAid UK, and is co-chair of the UN Food Systems Summit Youth Liaison Group. So, Sophie, we're interested to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the European Movement of Ireland and the European Commission for having me speak here today, especially as a young person. And I really encourage you for future events to have young people speak on panels as well. So last year in Ireland, in the university I studied at, the Students' Union had to set up a student-led food bank for other students. And within the first 20 minutes of this food bank opening, the food bank ran out of food. The need for nutritious food that was affordable and accessible among students was so high. And it's really heartening to hear from Ms. Nolan that food supply is not at risk within the EU today. But from a young person's viewpoint and perspective, and from the perspective of other people with lower economic statuses within the EU, access to food, which is affordable, is hugely at risk. Right now, the world has the largest generation of young people it has ever seen. They're producers, they're activists, and they're consumers, and they are at risk. Last year, over 160,000 young people and allies of youth gathered together at the UN Food Systems Summit to launch Act for Food, Act for Change, a youth-led movement to transform food systems right across the globe. And with members, young people from right across the globe, we call on leaders to, one, ensure everybody should be able to afford healthy and nutritious food. 2, back sustainable farming to regenerate our soils and reduce damaging chemicals. And 3, that every child should eat a healthy and sustainable meal at school, college, and nursery. Ms. Reid mentioned the Sophie report. Yesterday, one of our youth leaders spoke at the launch of the UN's Sophie report and called on leaders to hear young people this year and engage us in decision-making processes nationally and internationally. And right now, I'm doing the same. In a world where G7 ministers committed to sustainably increasing agricultural production and resilience of agricultural ecosystems, and as a response to the Russian invasion, and it's really heartening to hear that the European Commission has said that by mid-next year, they will propose legally binding targets to reduce food waste across the EU. I ask, where does access to healthy, nutritious, affordable diets fit? Where is that promise and where is that action? There's a very obvious and blinding need for a fundamental shift in EU agriculture and food systems towards sustainability in all its forms, including health of people, planet, biodiversity, and access to healthy, affordable diets. I applaud the EU in everything it's done to mitigate the effects of the current conflict for farmers, especially as they are the heart of our food systems globally. But please do hear the calls of young people globally. We are struggling. We are lining up outside food banks. Obesity is on the rise globally alongside stunting and wasting. We want to be included for the future of our planet, and the sustainability of your policies we need to be included. Thank you so much.
Sorry, thank you very much, Sophie. That was very concise and to the point. Now, I think each of our panel members have given us, I think, powerful and very different insights and perspectives into the food security, insecurity situation. So we're now ready to open the floor to you, the audience, and as a reminder, the email address to which you can send questions, comments is events@europeanmovement.ie, all small case, and no gaps. And this email address is at the bottom of your screen. So I see actually already we have a question in from Viv Raban, or Raban Viv, I'm not sure whether it's the surname before the, saying that I read that the FAO chief economist criticized the recent European Commission proposal to bring fallow land into production, saying that there would be environmental costs from this and that little quality food would actually be produced from such land. And the questioner is asking, would Michael Scannell or Michael Wallace have any reaction to on this point? Maybe we start with Michael Scannell first. Michael, please.
Okay, yes, we did make a specific provision in our communication on food security to allow a derogation for the so-called ecological focus areas to bring them back into production. But we were open and transparent about the limitations. Namely, this was rather late in the planting season. So, for example, too late to plant any wheat. However, it was meant as a signal to our farmers to basically, we need to produce more. And yes, we need to do it in a more sustainable manner. But at this moment in time, the critical issue confronting us on global markets is availability. And there is potential through these through this derogation to bring a significant area back into production on a temporary basis. But quite clearly, we accept this is not going to ease the fundamental shortages that arise from the closure of the Ukrainian exports on global markets. But we don't have the luxury of looking only to the macro solutions. We have to explore and examine each and every possibility. And in this specific case, there was a big demand from farmers themselves and from member states to introduce this particular derogation. We've asked member states to report on it and their experience with it, the extent to which it's been taken up, and eventually we'll have figures on the actual increased output that has resulted from it. But I emphasize we haven't lost sight of, and I mentioned it earlier, the more fundamental underlying issue of how we produce our food in a more sustainable manner to take account also of climate change objectives. So I stop at that. I'm not sure if Michael has anything to add.
Yeah, I think that has covered the issues pretty well. I would just maybe add to that it's another example of the sorts of contradictions or trade-offs that we clearly encounter when faced with a particular crisis that we're going through now and the urgent need to elevate levels of production. And clearly that means balancing the need to address a very proximate issue of increasing production and recognizing that choice to allow that derogation onto the ecological focus areas and allow crop growth to be grown on them will have an environmental impact. And that's one of the, I suppose, the downsides that we will encounter when we have to face those types of difficult choices that need to be made. This isn't going to get any easier as we look to the future, as the need to elevate levels of production on our land and the competition for our land resources, both for food and for a space for nature, and how we reconcile those issues and enhance the levels of productivity on our productive land so that we can maintain food production while also creating that necessary space for nature.
Thank you. Maybe a question to the whole panel. what, if you had a sort of a wish or guaranteed a wish, what one single action do you think would you recommend be taken in order to avoid a global food crisis? If there was one single thing that perhaps is not being done or needs to be done in a better way, what is that? What would that be in your view? I don't want to pick on anybody unfairly, but maybe Joanna, I'll call you first.
Okay, thank you, and I will challenge the European Commissioner on this one because we're in that grouping now. There's, along with the package, there's an announcement of lots more humanitarian aid. Great, the world says fantastic. It's a great announcement. It looks very responsive. But the problem is that the EU divides humanitarian funding and development funding very clearly. It's administered by different DGs, and so that's a problem if you want to, as I said, if you want to invest in systems, because it's entirely short term. So ECHO will only allocate funding 1 year at a time. You can try and have a broader program, but it will only allocate 1 year at a time. Now that doesn't allow us to build these systems to do longer term work. And other donors are the same. This isn't just ECHO, the US does it as well. And therefore the incentives are built in for short-termism. When I say that, food aid is not the answer, I think most people around this, many people in this group will know that for example, if you're taking food, and very often other donors, let's call it the big neighbour across the water, they use the UN system for their own agricultural surpluses. So they need to put food through the system. Again, it's not in their interest. So this is where the global interconnectedness plays out, that there are so many vested interests, and it's hugely politically controversial because there's so many vested interests, but the incentives are not there to take a longer term view when we look at the funding structure of the humanitarian industry.
Thank you, Joanna. I think I'll give maybe Michael a right of reply since the Commission was cited in this regard. Michael, would you like to come back?
Okay, well, very briefly, the most immediate short-term measure would be for Russia to stop its war in Ukraine, because that would immediately make available up to 20 million tons of grains on world markets and remove a huge tension in existing trade. But beyond that, there's a far more fundamental long-term issue of how we assist developing countries to improve their resilience. And yes, we currently address their needs through two pillars: humanitarian aid to address short-term needs. Basically, if you're hungry, you're not too worried about the medium to long term. Quite correctly, you want dinner today. And we have a whole range of measures there. Do they go far enough? Obviously, you'll have your own views in the matter. But more importantly, to address the fundamental underlying problems, you need to improve their production capacity, and you also need to do it in a more sustainable manner. And frankly, you would fill my office with the number of studies and literature on the experience in that context. There's a whole body of economics on development economics and how you strengthen agricultural productivity in developing countries in a sustainable manner. And frankly, the jury is still out on how you do it efficiently, effectively, transparently, how you work with the international community, with the countries concerned, etc. And there are different approaches. Here in Europe, we don't provide, for example, food aid directly because that can be very distorting on local markets. We tend to basically provide the assistance to the countries concerned to allow them themselves, working with the international donor agencies, etc., to decide their requirements, etc., etc. And of course, we have to do a whole lot on innovation, research, to basically improve how they deal with their current challenges. For example, we're currently focused in the developed world at the moment with the consequences of the war in Ukraine represented by wheat. But of even greater importance on the ground is rice. Rice doesn't particularly concern us here in Europe because we don't produce huge quantities of it. But from a development perspective, rice is an even more important commodity than wheat is. But I just make the point, not all the solutions lie in the hands of the European Commission or indeed Europe. This is our global issues. But I stop at that.
Sophie, would you like to come in with your wish, please?
Sure, I think it's a big question. So it's hard to think of one. But I would really, really like the European Commission and others to think about having young people higher up in decision-making processes. At the creation level of policies, they're not just the beneficiaries of policies, but they have to have key stakeholder contribution in the creation of such policies, whether these young people are in conflict-affected zones or any inner city areas across the EU. So I would really like to see young people being mentioned more in a lot of policies and reports, and also help in the contribution and creation processes of those policies.
Well, maybe I can just come in on that, Sophie. I mean, there are a lot of different things moving now in that direction. I think the European year that we've had this year, which is of course the European Year of Young People, that is, has given a sort of a fillip to the whole way in which we can take young people's views into account and help them and have them help us with our policy making. So I think there will be a lot more activity in that area, building on the European year, to be announced hopefully in the State of the Union speech by President von der Leyen, which is scheduled for September. Michael, I see a lot of questions coming in, but I give you your chance of what you think needs, the one single thing you would do if you had a magic wand. Yeah,
there's probably a lot of things that could be done, but I think if I was to pick one, it would be on the research side and reprioritizing research funding towards the types of, or at least a greater proportion of research funding towards types of research that will enhance the natural resource productivity of our agricultural systems, particularly looking at how we can translate research more effectively to the local situations faced in food insecure nations to help them improve their own situation, improve their production, and address the food insecurity challenges that they face. So we need much more locally tailored solutions, and we need to be able to invest much more into developing nations to help them actually find those solutions.
Okay, thank you all very much for those replies. Now we have a question in from Dr. Stephen Langrel, who is working in the EU delegation to Pakistan. He says, given recent events in Ukraine and the emergence of a new geopolitical reality, not least market sanctions or other international tensions, what are the prospects for continued access to cost-effective phosphorus and potassium as critical inputs for production, as well as nutrition, considering the main strategic reserves of both are located in China and Russia, Belarus, respectively? Maybe, Michael, you have a perspective on this?
Yes, indeed. I would be irresponsible if I didn't, because I mentioned it earlier, one of our key vulnerabilities in our agri-food production system in Europe is our reliance on imported energy and fertilizers. And that includes both phosphates and potash. And part of our problem is that we don't really have significant domestic sources, especially of potash. And our imports come in large part from, let's say, unreliable trade partners, Russia and Belarus being primary examples. But there are alternative markets. So, for example, later this afternoon, I will meet my counterpart from Canada. Canada produces vast quantities of potash. They're increasing further, basically, the exploitation of those resources. Similarly, Morocco produces very significant quantities of phosphate rock, and we're working very, very closely with them. We're not as critically dependent in the short term, at least, on phosphates and potash as we are for nitrogen-based fertilizers. There, the key input is gas, which again, in this case, is from Russia, an extremely unreliable partner. But bottom line, in all these areas, we need to become much more innovative if we're to be truly secure in relation to food security. And again, I come back to it, I repeat it on a number of occasions. Our agri-food production systems need to become much more sustainable, including on how we use inputs. So if you look at our CAP reform, if you look at the whole range of policies that we've adopted in recent months as a direct consequence of the events in Ukraine, we're basically accelerating our drive to move in a more sustainable direction, including on fertilizers, where, for example, there's going to be a huge drive towards green and blue hydrogen as a fuel source for existing nitrogen-based fertilizers. So a lot happening there, but I fully accept Stephen's point that this is an area where we're very, very vulnerable. Thank you.
Anybody else like to come in on that point? No? Okay, moving on then to the next question. We have, well, the question for Michael Scannell, Michael Wallace, or maybe others too. What are the main areas we should look at for policy coherence between EU agri-food policy and supporting agricultural development in developing country partners? For example, opportunities for trade, market development, etc. I would also think, Joanna, you would have something to say on this too. So please feel free. Who would like to come in on this?
I think it's Joanna's turn.
Joanna, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And actually, I'm struck by how much we have in common, and we're all coming from a slightly different angle. But actually, we are very seized of the immediate problem, but also everybody around here is talking about the longer term as well, and I think we can all agree on that. So yes, the point is that this point about systems is getting across, and that we need to look at the systems, whether it's market systems or agriculture systems. And one of the things that, as Michael Wallace was speaking, I thought this is what he's saying is so like a project that we're doing in Niger. Now, Niger bumps along at the bottom of the Human Development Index. It's always either bottom or second bottom, and it's a country we stick in there because it's just so poor. And there we're doing a very interesting project with funded by Unit Life, and it's about biofortified seeds. And they are more nutrient dense, and it's about sort of developing those seeds, using them, and then the solution is women, because we haven't mentioned women, but that's because it almost goes without saying that women always bear the brunt of a food security crisis. Women and children, women and girls are often the last to be fed. But we're putting the women in charge of this, and we're also linking in the private sector. So we're not seeing the systems in silos, but we're trying to join up those systems as a way of actually, you can have the policies, and you do need a policy environment that is conducive, but let communities work through their own solutions within the systems that they have. So I'm looking forward to having a further conversation on that project and see how we can share more ideas, because the magic wand of research isn't an immediate fix either. It's actually about saying we need to take a long-term view. And EU policies are very much digging in for the long term also, and also young people, absolutely crucial to that long term. Okay.
Thank you, Joanna. Anybody else want to come in on that? Well, we're coming towards the end, but I think maybe one more question, and this would be maybe for you, Michael. Are there any basic food staples that might be at risk in the event that the war in Ukraine, drags on for years? Or for anybody, I mean, anybody can answer, but I think, Michael, you've an eye on the markets.
Yes, yeah. Well, I think the most immediate one, and most of you will already be familiar with it, is sunflower oil. If you've done your shopping in a supermarket over the past several weeks, you'll have noticed the vegetable oil section has been largely empty, because basically we sourced 50% of our sunflower oil needs from Ukraine, and that supply chain is now massively disrupted. And this is extremely important, and triggered somewhat of an element of panic buying. So I suspect in each and every kitchen throughout Europe currently, there are several bottles of vegetable oils, because basically people overbought. And this is important to keep in mind, because sentiment is extremely important on food security. If and when consumers feel that there are going to be shortages and or an explosion in prices, they react accordingly with precautionary buying. And that can be extremely dangerous, and we have to be very, very mindful of it. But I'd say that's just a punctual example. But I mentioned earlier, you're not going to see a shortage of, for example, bread in Europe. We're massive producers of wheat. We have a very large exportable surplus. I think what's more important are the second round impact on global markets generally, if the war continues, because we will have to factor in basically the absence of Ukrainian grains and oilseeds from the market for not just weeks and months, but a much longer time period, which of course is why the UN is working to basically reopen the Black Sea ports. And in that kind of a scenario, obviously, you will see pressure on the affordability of food, and we can't lose sight of that. It's not just availability, it's affordability. In Europe, we're in a comfortable position that basically food is a relatively small share of overall expenditure, except for a significant population. And Sophie mentioned the case of students earlier having to rely on food banks. But when you move to developing countries, their spending on food very often is more than half of their daily expenditure. So any increase in prices has a hugely disproportionate impact on them. So that would be my main concern, should, and hopefully it won't be the case, the war in Ukraine continues. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick comment from anybody else before we wrap up? Michael, would you like to say anything, or sorry, Joanna, I see is keen. Yeah.
I was simply going to say, I think that's absolutely right. And the broader, the first reconstruction of Ukraine conference has already been held. My heart sinks to think of the money that is going to go in to rebuilding what has been destroyed in the last few months. I think that's profoundly concerning for the development community and for the rest of the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, we're coming to the end of today's event, and I'd really like to thank all our panelists for their inputs. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us. I mean, it is a very important subject. It's not going away. It's going to be staying up there, I think, as a very hot issue for some time. I'd like to thank EMI for helping us today with this event, and we look forward to organising more events like this on topical EU policy issues, as we have done in the past and as we will continue to do in the future. So thank you all very much. And again, thank you to our panel, and wishing you a nice day. It's a beautiful sunny day today, so enjoy it. Thank you. Bye-bye.